A monumental development unfolded in January 2026 that's poised to transform the entire structure of global finance. And this shift didn't originate from Washington, Wall Street, or the Federal Reserve. It emerged from the BRICS coalition: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, along with their newest members, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. They've just activated their new international monetary system. They've named it the unit, and at this very moment it's active and functioning for cross-border trade settlements. Let me state this with absolute clarity. This isn't a concept paper. This isn't an experimental phase. This isn't scheduled for future deployment. The unit is operating at this moment as a genuine alternative payment framework that enables these nations to execute substantial trade transactions without utilizing a single US dollar. Throughout your entire existence, the US dollar has reigned as the uncontested champion of international commerce. Virtually everything purchased, sold, or exchanged globally was valued and settled in dollars. It represented the only system of consequence, the only competitive arena worth entering. What has fundamentally shifted? The BRICS nations didn't assault the existing framework. They constructed an entirely separate one. They established their own financial infrastructure, their own channels, their own settlement apparatus, and they've just launched it for commercial use to nearly half the planet's population. They haven't demolished the dollar-centric system, at least at this stage, but for the first time in 8 decades, they've established a legitimate operational alternative, supported by the globe's most rapidly expanding economies and largest demographic populations. The age of the dollar facing absolutely no competition has concluded. The monopolistic control is shattered. So how does this unit actually operate? What distinguishes it from simply employing existing currencies? The architecture itself constitutes the complete strategy, and it's remarkably elegant in its simplicity. It rests on 2 core foundations that tackle the 2 primary anxieties nations harbor about any new currency: stability and sovereignty.
First foundation: gold collateralization. A complete 40% of the unit's value is anchored directly to physical gold stored in protected vaults throughout BRICS territories. This isn't theoretical gold. This isn't gold documentation or exchange-traded funds. This is genuine physical metal that can be inspected and authenticated. This represents their declaration to the global community that this currency is tethered to something tangible, something that has preserved value for 5 millennia, something the entire planet already recognizes regardless of political affiliations. It serves as their credibility foundation. And the remaining 60%, and this is where the approach becomes genuinely sophisticated, is supported by a calibrated basket of BRICS national currencies: Chinese yuan, Indian rupee, Russian ruble, Brazilian real, South African rand. This constitutes their significant wager on tomorrow. This element proclaims our collective economic strength, our natural resources, our manufacturing capabilities, our expanding consumer marketplaces, our combined GDP exceeding 28 trillion. That's substantial enough to sustain a global reserve currency. Therefore, the unit is constructed as 40% security through time-tested gold and 60% expansion potential through the ascending economic might of the developing world. Combined, it's engineered to be simultaneously stable enough to inspire confidence and dynamic enough to gain value as these economies flourish. This isn't merely a novel payment mechanism. This represents a direct structural confrontation to the manner global currency has operated since the Bretton Woods in 1944. So why at this moment? Why did these nations determine that January 2026 was the precise time to inaugurate their own monetary framework? What catalyzed this? The answer is February 2022. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Western nations, spearheaded by the United States, executed something unprecedented in contemporary financial chronicle. They immobilized over $300 billion of Russia's foreign currency reserves, capital Russia had amassed over generations and deposited in Western financial institutions. Hundreds of billions of dollars simply frozen, rendered inaccessible with the stroke of a pen.
For every other significant country observing, particularly those that occasionally have policy disputes with Washington or Brussels, this served as an absolute alarm, a frightening one. It illustrated in the most stark conceivable manner that the entire global financial architecture, the framework constructed on dollars, euros, and Western banking infrastructure, could be weaponized against you. If your reserves are maintained in their framework, they command your wealth. And if it could transpire with Russia, a nuclear-armed G20 economy, it could transpire with anyone. Saudi Arabia observed, China observed, India observed, Indonesia observed, Turkey observed, and they all contemplated the identical conclusion. We're exposed. Our national reserves could be eliminated instantaneously if we crossed the incorrect boundary. Discovering a contingency plan evolved from a discreet diplomatic conversation into a critical national security imperative. The unit represents that contingency plan made operational. It's not about initiating a financial confrontation with the West. It's about constructing a financial defense mechanism. They're developing a parallel network where their commerce, their reserves, their economic independence cannot be frozen, sanctioned, or dominated by external authorities who don't align with their interests. It's a direct reaction to a single potent lesson. If you don't command the financial framework you function within, that framework can be utilized to command you. Now, you might be considering this appears effective theoretically, but does it genuinely function in application? Can nations truly trade at magnitude without the dollar? The answer is demonstrably affirmative, and we don't need to theorize because we already possess proof of concept functioning at enormous scale at this very moment. Examine Russia and China. Currently, in January 2026, approximately 90% of bilateral commerce between these two economic powerhouses, a flow of hundreds of billions of dollars worth of petroleum, natural gas, machinery, electronics, agricultural products, is executed without employing a single US dollar. Zero. They settle in rubles and yuan directly. Russia and China didn't await some flawless system to be constructed. They required survival amid Western sanctions, so they pioneered the alternatives. Consider it this manner. The unit is the new expressway that BRICS has just officially inaugurated. But Russia and China have been navigating on the alternative routes and secondary paths for 4 years, successfully circumventing the dollar checkpoints, demonstrating the route functions. Their 90% statistic isn't a forecast or an objective, it's present reality, confirmed by trade statistics, and it signifies the first significant, undeniable structural fissure in the absolute supremacy of the dollar in global commerce. It validates that dollar-free commerce at scale isn't just theoretically feasible, it's already transpiring between two of the globe's largest economies. Let's discuss the magnitude of this inauguration, because magnitude is what converts an interesting experiment into a legitimate challenge to the existing framework. This is not a peripheral coalition of minor economies attempting to generate attention. The BRICS alliance, now broadened to incorporate major players like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran, signifies a staggering reality: nearly half of humanity. Approximately 46% of the global population currently resides in BRICS member or affiliated nations. That's over 3.6 billion individuals. Consider that number in practical context. The unit isn't launching into a theoretical future marketplace. It's launching with immediate integrated user base of billions of individuals in some of the globe's largest economies. It possesses instant purpose and instant need because this massive coalition of nations can immediately commence utilizing it to settle commerce amongst themselves.
petroleum from Russia to India, electronics from China to Brazil, agricultural commodities from Brazil to China, manufactured products from India to Egypt. All of this can now circulate through unit-based settlement. This sheer population, combined economic power exceeding 28 trillion in GDP, and command over critical resources, oil, gas, rare earth elements, agricultural commodities, is what renders this maneuver so historically consequential. It provides the project a gravitational attraction and potential global influence that simply cannot be dismissed or disregarded by Western financial establishments. And this directly affects something you might already possess: gold, because the unit is 40% backed by physical gold. The success and proliferation of this system generates massive structural requirement for the metal. BRICS nations are already the globe's largest gold purchasers and producers. China, Russia, India, they've been accumulating gold for years. But if the unit achieves serious acceptance, if additional countries participate and more commerce flows through the system, the requirement for gold backing could become exponential. This is why major financial institutions like J.P. Morgan are projecting gold prices reaching $5,000 per ounce by late 2026. Some analysts are estimating $8,000 or beyond if the unit achieves widespread acceptance. It's straightforward supply and demand calculations. You have massive, continuous institutional requirement from BRICS central banks needing to support an expanding currency system, encountering relatively constrained global supply of physical gold. The unit isn't just a currency innovation, it's a potential structural game changer for gold valuations. Every transaction settled in units necessitates gold backing. More units signifies more gold requirement, and we're discussing a system that could eventually process trillions in commerce annually. So what does all of this genuinely signify for the United States? To comprehend the implications, we need to understand a concept that most Americans don't even realize exists, but profit from daily. Economists designate it the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. Here's how it operates in simple language. Because virtually the entire globe utilizes U.S. dollars for international commerce and central banks maintain dollars as reserves, the U.S. receives massive financial advantages that no other nation enjoys. The U.S. can borrow capital more effortlessly and more economically than anyone else because there's always global requirement for dollar-denominated assets. America can sustain enormous trade deficits year after year, importing far more than it exports because other nations need to accumulate dollars to operate in global commerce. And most critically, the U.S. can utilize access to the dollar system as an incredibly powerful geopolitical instrument through sanctions, asset freezes, and financial exclusion. The BRICS unit is a direct, calculated confrontation to that entire configuration. This isn't about the dollar collapsing next week or hyperinflation materializing next month. That's not how this unfolds. Instead, the unit places America's free advantage on a countdown. It generates erosion, not explosion. For the first time in modern chronicle, there's a credible, large-scale alternative system being constructed by major economies that offers countries a viable method to opt out of dollar dependency. The unit generates choice where previously there was monopoly. And every time a nation chooses to settle even a fraction of their commerce in units instead of dollars, it incrementally diminishes the global requirement for dollars that supports American financial power. If sufficient countries make that choice, even for just some of their transactions, it slowly but inexorably erodes the exorbitant privilege. The U.S. isn't confronting a sudden catastrophic crash. What America confronts is the very real commencement of a gradual, persistent erosion of its most powerful economic advantage. And once that erosion initiates and gains momentum, it's nearly impossible to reverse because the benefits of the alternative become self-reinforcing. But here's what might be the most consequential strategic implication: the unit's influence on third-party nations, the countries that aren't in BRICS yet but are observing very attentively. Consider major developing economies: Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam. Many of these nations are struggling with massive debts denominated in US dollars. They're caught in currency constraints where their local currency depreciates, but their debt commitments stay in expensive dollars. They're also frequently caught between competing geopolitical pressures from the US and China.
For their leadership and central bankers, the BRICS unit isn't about ideological allegiance to China or Russia. It's about something much more practical and immediate: options and leverage. The capability to diversify risk, a method to trade with major partners without being completely vulnerable to dollar volatility or Western foreign policy determinations, a potential escape mechanism if they encounter sanctions or financial pressure. Every time one of these countries experiences economic stress connected to dollar debt, every time they feel pressured by dollar-based sanctions, every time they witness the Federal Reserve make policy determinations that cause turmoil in their currency markets, the BRICS alternative becomes more appealing. This is how a monetary transition becomes a geopolitical realignment. The unit functions like a gravitational force, attracting nations that desire more independence and financial sovereignty. It won't replace the dollar for everyone instantaneously, but it begins to bifurcate the globe into different financial spheres of influence. And the existence of the unit functioning and operational signals to the next wave of countries that joining is now a realistic possibility. The system is constructed, tested, and prepared for expansion. That optionality is the genuine threat to dollar dominance. Now we must address the elephant in the room, the biggest question mark and the most substantial challenge to the long-term success of the unit. For this system to not just launch, but genuinely thrive and expand over years and decades, the BRICS nations need something that's extremely challenging to achieve: sustained trust, coordination, and unified commitment. And that is their greatest vulnerability. Let's be completely frank about the internal tensions. The BRICS alliance is a coalition of countries that have often been competitors and in some cases have directly conflicting strategic interests. China and India, the two largest members and demographic giants, have active border disputes and had deadly military confrontations as recently as 2020. Their competition for regional influence in Asia is fierce. Russia and China present a unified front against the West, but historically, they've been rivals for Central Asian influence and have a complicated relationship. Brazil's democratic government often has very different political values and priorities than Russia's authoritarian system. South Africa's economy is minuscule compared to China's and India's, creating asymmetry in influence and benefits. Managing a shared currency system requires relinquishing significant amounts of individual monetary sovereignty and policy command. That's an enormous request for any proud, powerful nation. What transpires during the inevitable economic crisis? If one member country encounters a severe recession or currency crisis, do the others rescue them? Who determines monetary policy? Who commands the gold reserves? What if political relations deteriorate between members? These are the kinds of questions that destroyed previous monetary unions. The European common currency, the euro, nearly collapsed during the Greek debt crisis precisely because of these coordination problems, and those were countries with much more shared chronicle, values, and political integration than BRICS has.
So the greatest threat to the unit might not come from the US or Western sanctions or financial warfare from outside. The threat might be internal fracture, disagreement, and the simple difficulty of maintaining unity among diverse nations with competing interests over the long term. This is the vulnerability that Western analysts are counting on, the bet that BRICS will eventually fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. But here's the counter-argument that's important to consider. Shared opposition can be a powerful unifying force. The BRICS nations may have differences, but they share one overwhelming common interest: reducing dependency on a Western-dominated financial system that can be weaponized against them. That shared motivation, driven by genuine security concerns after witnessing Russia get financially isolated, may be strong enough to overcome internal differences, at least for the foreseeable future. So, let's synthesize everything and arrive at the bottom line. What's the final assessment of the BRICS unit going live in January 2026? This is not the narrative of the US dollar dying next month. That's a sensational headline designed for clicks, but it's not grounded in reality. The launch of the unit is better understood as the starting signal for a long, slow-motion transformation of the global financial architecture. The unit's real victory isn't immediately replacing the dollar. Its success is simply existing and functioning as a credible working alternative. For 80 years since Bretton Woods, there was effectively no choice in reserve currencies and international settlement. The dollar was it. Now there is a choice, and that changes everything. What we are witnessing in real time is the end of a total monopoly and the beginning of genuine competition in global reserve currencies. What this means in practical terms: the dollar's dominance will face steady, incremental pressure rather than a single catastrophic collapse. It means countries around the world suddenly have negotiating leverage they never possessed before. When the U.S. threatens sanctions, a country can now credibly respond: "We'll just shift more of our trade to the unit system." That's a game changer in geopolitical negotiations. The world isn't splitting cleanly into two separate financial blocks overnight. Instead, we're evolving into a much more complex, multi-layered financial ecosystem where countries will use different systems for different purposes, different trading partners, different transactions. Some trade in dollars, some in units, some in euros, some in yuan. The BRICS unit has firmly planted its flag in this new multipolar landscape, and once planted, it's very difficult to remove. The game has fundamentally changed. The rules that governed global finance for your entire life are being rewritten in real time. And whether you're an investor, a business owner, or just someone trying to protect your savings, understanding this shift isn't optional anymore. It's essential, because the world that emerges from this transformation will look very different from the one we've known. The era of unchallenged dollar supremacy is over. What comes next is anyone's guess, but ignoring it is no longer an option.